Welcome to Bonus XP, a sideshow of the RPG Heroes podcast. In Bonus XP, I discuss what I would call heroic legacies, something that an RPG hero has left for us mortals to use and to learn from. Much like the first edition of Dungeons & Dragons awarded you experience points for finding treasure, this show hopes to improve your game by exploring the best RPG products. The very first heroic legacy that our quest has uncovered is the Cyberpunk RED Jumpstart Kit by R. Sorian. It is a beautiful box full of role-playing goodness, and I think we should roll a local expert check to see what it's all about. So the first thing we want to know about any heroic legacy is which RPG hero left it behind for us to use. Well, Cyberpunk is an IP owned by R. Sorian, and it all comes from the enormous brain of Mike Pondsmith. Mr. Pondsmith is responsible for my favorite Cyberpunk game of all time so far, which is Cyberpunk 2020. Before that, of course, there was an earlier version as well. There have been some versions in between, but they didn't really grow as big as 2020. And now, of course, Cyberpunk RED is about to hit the shelves. I believe digital versions will become available halfway November and physical maybe a week later or so. Several of my guests on the RPG Heroes podcast have already mentioned Mike Pondsmith as an RPG hero, and they've given very good reasons to do so. I really admire Mike Pondsmith for his creativity, his willingness to diverge from the mainstream, and his absolute passion for the cyberpunk genre. His approach to the business side of role-playing games is also something that I truly admire. His company is kept small, like a family company, I would say, and they do things like supporting your local gaming stores by selling Cyberpunk RED through the Bits and Mortars program. If you don't know what that is, check the show notes. Mike's approach to the community is another one that I really appreciate. He does very thoughtful and good interviews, and he makes sure that his company reaches out to people through social media quite a lot with a lot of positive messages. So what exactly is the Cyberpunk RED Jumpstart Kit? Well, it is a set of 7 PDFs, which is quite a lot when you think about it. I got the digital version, clearly. So 7 PDFs, and the main 2 PDFs would be the rule book, which gives you the quick and dirty kind of rules of the Cyberpunk RED game. So you could see it as a starter set or a quick start type set. And the rules are very easy to read, very quick to go through, and they get you going into the game as quickly as possible, which is wonderful. But, and you know, many games nowadays do this, right? They bring out some sort of quick start PDF or a quick start rulebook with a portion of the rules that is enough to play a few games and see if you're really interested. However, the Jumpstart Kit doesn't just give you that. It also gives you a world book, which tells you quite a lot of lore about the cyberpunk world and how it's been updated from 2020 all the way up to the time of the Red, 2045, which means that Cyberpunk RED takes place roughly between the previous version of Cyberpunk 2020, which is, arguably the worst year in history, and the computer game, which is supposed to come out at some point as well, which takes place in 2077. So we have a rule book and we have a lore book, but it doesn't stop there. You get a separate PDF with the maps for an adventure that is included in the book. You get a separate PDF with the pre-generated characters that you can use for that adventure. It gives you a PDF with standees, in other words, little printable characters that you could print out, fold, and then put in a little standee to use as a miniature, which I think is a great idea. There's a few companies doing that nowadays, and I think it's a wonderful way to supply buyers of your game with miniatures that might not be so easy to source. There's not a lot of cyberpunk miniatures out there. Then, On top of all that, it gives you an easy reference sheet, kind of like the back of a Dungeon Master or a Game Master screen, with a quick overview of the most important rules. And not just that, they give you this in a letter and in a tabloid form. Well, what more could you ask for? What I found super helpful is that the World Book includes a really cool adventure that you can play, and that I have actually run twice now, once for friends and once for a convention called Albacon. And I have to say, it's pretty quick and easy to understand as a game master, but it does take a little bit of work to flesh it out a bit. And if you're interested in doing so, I would recommend watching a video by Seth Skorkowski on this topic. He gives some really good advice to flesh out the adventure a little bit. On top of the adventure and the maps and the pre-generated characters, you also get a few scream sheets, which is a cool term from Cyberpunk for like newspaper sort of, or news articles. And these articles give you extra hooks for new adventures that you yourself can then design. So is this a full game then? Well, yes and no. I mean, no, it's not the full rules. The full rules are coming out soon, halfway November. And it doesn't give you character generation or character creation at all. But it does give you enough to play a couple of sessions and decide whether or not this is the game for you, which I think is just great. It also doesn't have lists of cool equipment that you can use. They've just given some generic equipment to each character, and that's it. And all those pieces of equipment, especially the weapons, have been given very generic names as well, which is one of the things my players noticed, like, so does this game only have just heavy pistols and that's it? No, of course not. The full game will have lots of options actually to have different kinds of games, different branded sort of weapons, and also to customize your own weapons, which sounds just absolutely awesome to me. So in conclusion, what is it? Well, it's quick start rules, it's a huge amount of lore, it's some standees, maps, pre-generated characters, and an easy reference sheet for all the rules, plus a cool adventure and some adventure hooks for future use. So what can we learn from the Jumpstart Kit? Well, I think one thing that I've certainly learned from it is that when you are presented with an adventure in any kind of game reference book, it is up to you to make that adventure your own and present it to your players in a way that suits your group and your style of running a game, and that it's perfectly fine for an adventure to not chew out every tiny little detail for you. In fact, in my experience, it kind of made the game better because it gave me the feeling that I have space and I have an opportunity to move around the way that I want to. Another thing that I've learned from the adventure specifically is that the way they've structured the adventure is very much non-linear. So there are several options that you can choose from as a game master depending on the makeup of your group and the type of players that you have at your table, which I think is a great thing. The adventure also taught me that if you want to run a one-shot, especially for something like a convention, it's a smart idea to very quickly confine the player characters to a specific space so that there's not too many variables going on, and then you can control things like time, etc. much more easily. And this adventure confines you to a building, and that worked perfectly. And because the building belonged to one of the player characters, I guess that's not really a spoiler. Because it belongs to one of the player characters, you also immediately have a reason to care as a player. And I thought that was very, very powerful. Aside from the adventure, what I think we can learn from the Jumpstart Kit is that just because it's quick start doesn't mean it has to be free or it has to be very basic or very kind of devoid of detail. In fact, the world book itself is just a treasure trove of detail. I'll get into that a moment later. And also the rules give you plenty of detail to play lots of games. In fact, I think if you have the Jumpstart Kit and lots of imagination and maybe some old Cyberpunk 2020 books, you could probably get away with playing just Jumpstart Kit for quite a while. And one thing that I've always loved about the Cyberpunk books that I've seen and read and used quite a lot is that these books, they really breathe the atmosphere that the game is trying to create. So there's, for instance, quotes from people, and the book is kind of told or written in a way that you can almost hear Mike Pondsmith's voice telling you about it. There's a certain humor, a certain style of language that is chosen to really reflect the game that you're about to play. And on top of that, you get to see things from the eyes of people that live in that world. So there are parts of the text that are written from the eyes of somebody who lives in Night City, the city that a lot of these games take place in. And I guess as a last thing that I've learned from the Jumpstart Kit is that you do not necessarily need long lists of very specific equipment to have a good time with a game like this. At first, I was a little bit disappointed with the lack of flavor in the weapons and the other equipment, but very quickly I found that because we didn't have to focus on the minute details of exactly which gun who everybody has, we had a lot more time to actually focus on the characters and what they wanted and how they experienced things. And it gave me freedom to kind of make things up as I went along, which was a lot of fun. So then, how can you use the Jumpstart Kit? Well, I used it to run a convention game for Albacon, and the day before I ran the same adventure for my friends as a trial run. And I used the adventure that I've talked about before on this episode, the apartment it's called, and that's about what I did with it. But if there's anything else that you could do with this, well, like I said, you can easily, I think, play a few more adventures after the initial one, especially given the scream sheets or the adventure hooks that R. Telsorian has given you in the Jumpstart Kit. And I think especially the world book is incredibly useful if you want to play a cyberpunk type game and you need lore, you need information, you need background stuff. And I think the world book, aside from whether or not you want to play Cyberpunk RED or Cyberpunk 2020 even, if you want to play, let's say, D&D with a cyberpunk flavor, or you want to play any other kind of game that has a cyberpunk thing going on, I think the world book is incredibly valuable because it gives you a great overview of the dark future of Earth circa 2045. And even if you don't want to do that, just reading the world book and reading how the vision of Mike Pondsmith kind of tells you what has led up to now and what all the events that have taken place across the world that kind of come to this point where we now start the game, I think is also, if you analyze that and you read that, it can give you tons of inspiration for playing a game earlier in the timeline or later in the timeline, or perhaps for crafting your own kind of world lore for your own game. And it doesn't even have to be a cyberpunk world. It could be fantasy. It could be anything. But if you look at the way that he has structured this story and how we go from real history, stuff that we know, to making it more and more fictional, I think that's a very clever thing. Of course, the PDF with the standees can be used in any kind of cyberpunk or sci-fi game, so it gives you some assets to play around with, either on the tabletop when you print them out, or perhaps on any kind of virtual tabletop if you just if you know how to crop a picture, you can basically use them. The books, all the PDFs are full of really great art that you can use for any sci-fi or cyberpunk related game if you want to cannibalize the books a bit. And I think its intended purpose, and I think it's great for that as well, is you can use it to introduce people to a whole new game and a whole new type of world, and maybe even to role-playing games in general, because it keeps the rules nice and neat and simple and easy to remember. It gives you this easy reference sheet, which helps to keep things flowing. It gives you some characters, so you don't have to worry about spending lots of time to create them, and it even gives you adventure hooks. So basically, it sets you up for possibly a long-term gaming group that can play Cyberpunk RED once that comes out. Well, that's it for Bonus XP. I hope you got something out of it and that you like the format. Let me know. Want to keep up with the latest news about my podcast? Then hop on over to Twitter at RPGHeroes1. Check out the full show notes with all the links at rpgheroes.buzzsprout.com. Want to support the show and join other supporters on my Discord channel? Then I would be honored if you check out my Patreon page at patreon.com/rpgheroes. You can also buy RPG products with my affiliate code or purchase some cool RPG Heroes shirts, mugs, etc. Let me know what other cool RPG products you would like me to review in this fashion. Until next time, stay heroic!